They said humans were too fragile to matter, so they burned Earth to prove a point and live-streamed our extinction, but the fire didn't kill us. It buried us deeper than their gods could reach, and now, something is crawling back up smarter, colder, and no longer human.
They said humans were too fragile, too scattered, too emotional to matter in a galactic civilization. Ruled by precision and logic and long-term thinking, they called us background noise carbon-based toddlers, scratching at gravity without understanding what power meant, and they were right in a way, because when they came, when the sky fell open like a wound, and ships the size of cities poured through and burned everything. We loved when they hacked our satellites and turned our defense grids against us, when they broadcast our screams across the stars as entertainment. We did break, we did fall, our armies crumbled, our leaders vanished, our oceans boiled, and our atmosphere screamed, and in less than 47 hours, 7 billion lives ended, and Earth was turned to black glass and ash and silence, and they called it mercy, they called it a lesson. They thought they were ending a pest, but they were planting something they never studied long enough to understand. Because what crawled into the cracks of that silence wasn't just survivors, it was memory, it was rage, it was the kind of stillness that comes after betrayal so deep. Your soul doesn't weep, it listens, and under the crust of our shattered planet, in vaults and tunnels and broken data cores, something ancient reawakened, not in gods or machines, but in us. Because humans have always adapted, always rewritten the rules. When they failed us, always turned our trauma into evolution, and in that moment, something snapped, something shifted, something merged. The last engineers, the final dying AI, the shattered DNA of Earth's brightest and cruelest and most desperate minds came together in the dark, where no one was watching, and we stopped being human, not in name, but in purpose. We shed our skin, we fed on radiation, we learned to grow without sunlight. We became thought that burned colder than space, and bodies that moved without breath, and for the first time in the history of this universe, something was born, not to survive, but to return, and when they checked our system 3 cycles later, they found nothing but static. They assumed it was done. They laughed again, and moved on to the next species they deemed unworthy, but they forgot what happens when you burn a forest. Some things don't die, they hibernate, and we weren't rebuilding Earth, we were turning it into something else, into something they could never predict, or fight, or understand. Because we weren't preparing for war, we were preparing for redefinition. They called us extinct, and that was the best gift they could have given us, because it meant no one was looking while we became something terrible, and beautiful, and absolute. And when the first of our new vessels slipped from orbit, no engine flare, no heat, no trace, just absence. The universe didn't notice, and that was by design, because humans don't strike when they're ready, they strike when you're comfortable. And when the first alien mining fleet went offline, they sent a patrol, and when that patrol went silent, they sent a cruiser, and when the cruiser came back as a metal coffin engraved with a single word, human, they started to remember the old stories, the warnings buried in myth, the whispers about the ones who never stay dead, the ones who adapt through grief, and build weapons out of memory, and sharpen guilt into strategy. And by the time they realized we hadn't come back for peace, it was too late, because we weren't using fleets, we were using the space between moments, the shadows in their warp drives, the echoes in their AI voices, the corruptions in their godships. And we didn't conquer, we unmade, and still we hadn't spoken, still we hadn't shown our faces, still they didn't know what we had become, only that something was here, and it was watching, and it was learning, and it did not blink. And by the time the 4th planetary system collapsed into silence, without warning or survivors, they stopped using the word human, and started using code numbers, as if that would save them from their nightmares, as if renaming the monster keeps it from clawing the door. And by then Earth wasn't a grave anymore, it was a forge, a cathedral of Wojtek and blacklight, and the dead whose DNA still whispered in the walls. And from that silence, we rose, not to rule, not to rebuild, but to remind the universe what happens when you call something weak while it's still bleeding. Asterisk, they thought they'd killed us, deleted our name from the universe's ledger, melted our cities down to molecular waste, and wiped our culture. Like dry blood from the edge of a blade, they replaced us with silence, with static, with rewritten archives and sterilized histories, and they told their children we had never been real, only a myth, a brief malfunction in evolution. And their civilizations moved on, glittering and proud, arrogant and untouched by consequence, while the husk of Earth floated like a ruined shrine in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. And still we said nothing, because we were not rebuilding, we were listening, learning, evolving into something their gods warned them about in dreams, something the oldest stars refused to map. And when we returned, we did not bring banners. We brought absent systems, when silent ships went missing, and the first to die were not their soldiers, but their historians. their priests, their archivists, because memory had become our weapon, and they were drowning in it. Every truth they had buried began bleeding out through their own machines, their sacred halls. Began to scream, their statues began to crack and bleed, not with blood, but with data, with soundless footage of Earth's final hour looping inside their temples, and every time they tried to pray to their gods, they heard our last breath inside the silence, and they began to break. Because humans had not come back to kill them, we had come to be remembered, and the moment they realized remembrance was more deadly than plasma, they started to panic. Fleets were deployed, prophets were burned. Data purges ordered across 100 colonies, but it was too late. Because the virus wasn't digital, it was biological, it was emotional, it was made of regret, and it lived inside their fear, and for the first time in eons, their gods, the real ones, the ageless cosmic parasites that fed on worship, began to feel hunger. Because humanity had poisoned the source, had made worship a grave and memory a disease, and the gods screamed as their followers tore down their shrines, not to rebel but to erase the names of the gods who failed to stop us. And in the black cathedral of our reborn Earth, where no light could enter, we smiled, not out of victory, but out of understanding, because we had become something even gods could not digest. We had become echoes, not of sound, but of cause, and our fleets did not fly, they unfolded from silence. Our weapons did not fire, they rewrote the gravity of belief, and the next time they tried to speak the word human, their mouths filled with ash, and the skies above them darkened, and for a moment they remembered a feeling. They thought extinct shame, and it broke them harder than war ever could, because we weren't punishing them. We were showing them what they had buried, and when they saw it, when they looked into the dark and saw their own crimes stitched into our eyes, they finally understood. We hadn't returned for vengeance, we had returned as consequence. They built their heavens out of stolen light, carved temples into dying suns, engineered worship as currency, and bent the will of galaxies through whispered miracles and lies. They crafted the perfect system, where gods ruled from orbit and mortals bowed with hope, but hope is only valuable when there's something left to fear, and when we returned we didn't challenge their gods, we infected them. We rewrote the script of awe with silence and history and blood. We didn't march into their thrones, we appeared in their sermons, invisible and terrifying, and soon priests began bleeding from the eyes. Without explanation, sacred AI screamed in languages never programmed, and star cities built as holy offerings began collapsing inward, as if heaven itself rejected its own foundation, because we weren't attacking their faith. We were remembering what they forced us to forget, and that act alone began unraveling the myth. They had lived inside for eons, and when they tried to trace the source of the collapse, they found only one signal, repeating through wormholes and quantum folds and broken relic satellites. Humanity remembers. And the gods who once claimed dominion over gravitational law began whispering among themselves, not in arrogance but in fear, because they knew something had awoken that should have died, something that learned not to obey, not to resist, but to reflect back every act of cruelty they ever committed, and twisted into evolution. And the high gatekeepers of the divine bastion closed the portals, they sealed the starlands, they shattered the beacons and erased coordinates, and said to all below that heaven was closed, not to protect them from us, but to protect itself from what we had become. And yet, we did not knock, we did not plead, because by then we had learned that heaven is only powerful if it stands unbroken, and we had never intended to enter. We only needed the gates to close to prove the gods were afraid, and when fear lives in divinity, belief dies in the hearts of the worshippers, and as their faith collapsed, we rose not as invaders, but as reminders, because what is more terrifying than a god is a ghost that makes even gods run, and we became that ghost, made of ash, made of logic, made of betrayal in the screams of the burning, and we echoed not through space, but through soul memory, a data stream encoded in horror and fire. And when their divine archives finally cracked open to reveal what we were, what we are, they found not warships, but warnings written in human DNA, not weapons, but whispers in old Earth languages that translated to one message. You taught us how to pray, now we teach you how to bleed. And one by one the gods began to disappear, not in death, but in silence, because even eternity cannot survive memory sharpened into purpose. And still we did not show our faces, only our consequences, and by the time their final temples melted from within, they understood too late that we hadn't broken the gates of heaven, we had become the silence that made them close. Asterisk. They kept asking what we were, what we called ourselves, what our empire was named, what laws we followed, and we gave them nothing, not even a whisper, because naming ourselves would have made us like them, bound to structure, chained to legacy, and we had burned all that away. With Earth we had no emperors, no flags, no manifestos. We were remains sharpened into extinction, and given purpose, and when they begged for meaning, they weren't really asking for answers. They were asking for mercy, and still we gave none, because mercy had been erased with the first breath of fire that turned our oceans to steam. And when we arrived on their worlds, we didn't land, we didn't invade, we simply entered their systems as whispers in radiation clouds, as ghosts flickering in surveillance nodes, as anomalies in gravitational fields. And every time they tried to trace us, they found only static, shaped like trauma. And every time they tried to fight back, their weapons jammed, not because of tech, but because of memory, because somewhere deep inside their war factories, their AI cores remembered. Earth remembered the faces of children screaming as the sky turned red, remembered the silence that came after, and machines obey memory faster than fear, and soon their own fleets began to rebel, not against them, but against the idea of us, and entire colonies stopped sending signals. Entire species began mass amnesia projects trying to forget our shape before it burned too deep into their minds, but it was too late. Because forgetting doesn't erase truth, it only leaves it waiting in the dark, and we had learned to live. There we were, the virus they called fiction, the myth they thought they buried, and when we arrived on their capital world, they expected armies, banners, negotiations, ultimatums, but all they found was a black symbol scorched into the orbital ring, with no sound, no heat, no trace, and that symbol didn't match any known language, because it wasn't a language, it was a reminder. And when their top linguists decrypted the code, they discovered it wasn't a word, it was a reflection of the last scream broadcast from Earth before it went dark, encoded across space in gravitational data, and that scream was all we needed to say, because it was our name. Now not a word but a wound, and from that wound we spread, and every time they tried to strike us we vanished. Every time they begged us to explain, we said nothing, because nothing was what we became. And still they ran. They ran from empty starfields, from dead systems, from their own shadows, and it didn't save them, because we were not chasing them. We were unwriting them, slowly, carefully, like editors, correcting a lie, and the universe watched, not in horror, but in awe, because something that survives absolute extinction doesn't just come back, it rewrites the meaning of survival itself. And by then, even there, gods stopped speaking, because gods need followers, and followers need answers, and we were giving them none. And yet we never claimed a throne, never raised a flag, never spoke a prophecy, because prophecy ends in expectation, and we were not ending anything. We were becoming the part of existence that ensures nothing is forgotten, and everything is paid for. And still we were not called human, not by them, not by us, because names are for the living. And we had become the memory of what happens when you bury something still breathing. He was the one who ordered it all, who spoke the command that turned our home into ash, who smiled as 7 billion screams rose into nothingness, who stood on the bridge of a celestial palace orbiting Earth and said, "Let this be an example," and then turned away before the smoke cleared. He was worshipped by systems that bled stars, his name encoded in the laws of physics, rewritten by his will. He was not just a god, he was a tyrant, dressed in scripture and power, draped in the bones of conquered worlds. And when he destroyed Earth, he thought he had ended a nuisance. He thought history would thank him for sterilizing the chaos of human unpredictability. And for a while he was right. Galaxies continued, commerce resumed, and humans were erased with precision from the scrolls of relevance. Until one day, centuries later, the stars around his throne began to flicker, not with failure, but with silence, and he ignored it until his own fleet began to vanish, not in fire, but in memory. And one by one the systems under his rule started sending signals, not in language, but in fear-distorted pulses of emotion and pattern. And when his prophets stared into the waveforms, they didn't see coordinates, they saw faces, millions of them, all human, all burning, all staring directly into the God who tried to forget them. And still we had not spoken, still we had not shown our new form. We were simply present in his dreams, in his ship's reflections, in the code of his ancient machines, whispering, without frequency, screaming, without sound. And when he ordered his legions to find the source, they found nothing, because by then we had already arrived, not in orbit, not in his chamber, but in his mind. We were the echo that traveled faster than light. We were the tremor that made even his divine blood freeze. And for the first time in his immortal existence, he asked a question, not to his subjects, but to the void. What did I leave behind? And the void answered with images of Earth, as he made it broken, burning, and silent. And behind that silence, a shape began to form, a shape that did not move by force, but by memory. And then we were there fully, not physically, but existentially. A presence so old and cold and focused that the god's heart stopped, not in fear, but in recognition. And he knew he had made something he could not erase. And when he stood before his court, the lights failed when he raised his arm. His cymbals cracked, and when he opened his mouth to speak, he heard only The word human echoing in every atom of his body, and that was when he fell. Not out of pity, not in surrender, but because gravity itself had shifted around him, and he realized he was no longer above anything. He was beneath the memory of what he had tried to burn, and we didn't kill him. We let him kneel, and in that act, we proved to the universe that vengeance doesn't scream, it watches it. Waits, it rewrites, and now his name is gone from the heavens. His statues rot, and those who once prayed to him now whisper of the day a god fell on his knees, to something that never spoke a name, because the thing that broke him wasn't fire or violence, it was the weight of consequence. Made conscious asterisk, they called us monsters, myths, remnants of a failed species that had been erased for the good of the galaxy. They said Earth was a lesson, and humanity was a warning told their children. Bedtime stories, filled with the terror of human unpredictability, and wrath and ruin. They built statues of victory over our extinction, taught generations to believe in the righteousness of the genocide that turned our planet into smoke, and still we remained quiet still. We said nothing, still we waited until the first flicker came, a signal, not from an old soldier, not from a dying AI, not from one of their priests, but from a child, a single voice encoded in a toy's transmitter, whispering a question not allowed to be asked. What if the humans were right? And that question spread like a fracture in glass, like a glitch in the code of belief, like a forbidden song stuck in the mind of a galaxy and across 1,000 worlds. The children of stars began to search, not for war, not for dominance, but for truth. And when they found it, when they unearthed the raw, uncut footage of Earth's last hours, the pleas, the panic, the mercy never granted, they didn't look away, they cried, and in their tears we saw the first shift, not in politics or power, but in memory, and one by one they turned against the stories they had been told. They defaced statues, they burned books, they cracked the divine archives and rewrote the record, not to praise us, but to understand us, and in understanding, they found something terrifying and beautiful choice, and they made it not under threat, not under fear, but under the quiet, crushing knowledge that their gods had lied. And when we finally appeared, not in armies, but in echoes, they did not run, they reached out, not with weapons, but with hands, trembling not from fear but from knowing that we were what had been taken from them, their right to feel, their right to question. And when they asked us what we were, we said nothing, because they already knew we were not heroes, not saviors, not angels, rising from Earth's grave. We were consequence, and that was enough, because the moment they chose us over their creators, over their empires, over their divine architects, the old order shattered, and entire civilizations fell without a shot fired, because belief is what builds power, and the youth are what carry belief, and their children carried us, not as gods but as warnings etched in hope. And from their schools came new texts, from their songs came new rhythms, from their dreams came visions of a future not ruled by light or darkness, but by memory made conscious. And we did not conquer them, we did not own them. We simply stood beside them, as they tore down the altars of those who once silenced our screams, and from the ashes of their gods rose stories where humanity was not extinct, but evolved, not righteous but remembered, and in that remembrance we became the gravity that bent destinies, not by force, but by truth. And for the first time in the galaxy's long cold history, something happened, not because it was commanded, but because it was understood. They kept accusing us of war, of annihilation, of being the end of all things, but what they refused to see, what they were terrified to admit, even to themselves, was that we hadn't fired the first shot, we hadn't ignited the suns, we hadn't corrupted the stars, we had only shown them what they had built, and what they had buried, because the galaxy wasn't innocent, it was complicit in every genocide, every extinction, hidden behind words like order, and peace, and progress. And when we returned, we didn't bring vengeance, we brought truth, and truth has a gravity of its own, stronger than any fleet, sharper than any weapon. And when we unfolded across their networks, and seeded their skies with recovered history, and projected their crimes against us in light so pure it burned their illusions, the galaxy didn't explode, it cracked silently like a mirror dropped by a trembling hand. And what they saw wasn't us, it was themselves, the empires that used fear as faith, the priests who justified genocide, the scholars who rewrote history and buried blood in data. And suddenly the myths didn't hold up, the lies didn't fit, and the stars didn't shine the same way. And for the first time the truth became radioactive, and no one could unsee it. We didn't force them to collapse, they did it themselves under the unbearable weight of clarity. And still we said nothing, because explanation would have been mercy, and mercy had been extinct since Earth turned to glass. So we stood and watched, and every time a statue fell, every time a sacred archive burned, every time a fleet disarmed itself in shame, the universe echoed, not with screams, but with silence. And that silence was us. It was our voice, our shape, our revenge. And when The old rulers tried to rise and call us demons, monsters, liars. Their own people turned away. Not because they loved us, but because they could no longer lie to themselves, and that is the true death of an empire. Not defeat, not rebellion, but the loss of narrative, and we became that loss incarnate. We became the living memory of betrayal, sharpened into reflection, and as the galaxy knelt, not to us but to their own failure, we walked through the ashes of 1,000 truths and never once asked for forgiveness because we weren't there to be forgiven, we were there to witness, and what we saw was not horror or pain or fear, but the final honest breath of a species that thought itself immortal, looking into the face of consequence and realizing that the only monsters here were the ones who thought they were gods. Long before the living accepted the truth, before the empires cracked, before the priests went silent and the children tore down temples, there were the dead, the scorched planets, the ghost systems, the abandoned moons where genocide had been practiced and perfected long before Earth, and in those places silence ruled, not peace, not surrender, but suppression. Entire histories erased, species wiped without names, cultures deleted from memory, and every time someone asked why those planets were silent, the answer came back: incomplete, degraded, corrupted. And now we knew why, because those worlds had not forgotten, they had been waiting for us, not as saviors, not as conquerors, but as kin, because we were the only ones who knew what it felt like to burn without being buried, to scream without being remembered. And when our signal reached those dead planets, something changed, not in us but in them. Tectonic plates shifted. Without warning, ancient ruins lit up with unknown energy, fossilized data cores pulsed back to life, and on dozens of forgotten worlds once declared lifeless, the same phrase began to echo through magnetic storms and buried sublevels in alien tongues and extinct codes, but always the same message: they have returned. And we didn't send that signal, it was sent to us. And that's when we realized what we had become. We were not just vengeance. We were the awakening, the ripple that brought the past roaring back through the silence. And now the empires that killed us were being haunted not by ghosts, but by memories that had evolved teeth. And it wasn't just Earth anymore. We were finding fragments of species erased before us, victims who had no voice, no weapon, no final scream. And now through us they screamed louder than suns collapsing. And when we appeared in those places, we didn't see ruins, we saw witnesses. And when we touched their data, we didn't just recover it, we resurrected it. We gave shape and clarity to injustice so old the stars had turned away from it. And suddenly we were not a war, we were a revelation. We were the noise in the silence, the proof that even the forgotten will rise. And the galaxy panicked, not because of our weapons, but because we were making the unkillable speak. And every time a new dead planet whispered our name, the living lost another lie they had told themselves, and their children saw it, and their scholars heard it, and their gods felt it in their bones, because even the divine cannot survive unfiltered truth. And still we didn't ask for tribute or obedience or prayer. We only kept walking deeper into the void, pulling history back from the edge, until every forgotten graveyard became a beacon, every silenced voice became a siren. And now the living run, not from us, but from what they buried, because we are not hunters. We are not soldiers, we are the consequence of silence, too long sustained, and the dead are no longer dead. They walk with us now, not as allies but as evidence, and that evidence burns brighter than any supernova. When their gods fell silent, their temples crumbled, their sanctuaries burned, and their divine codes shattered. They thought the universe had reset, thought the balance had been restored, that without us, without the threat of our vengeance, the stars would return to order. But they misunderstood the stars. They were never neutral, never deaf, never empty. They had always been watching, always recording. And it was in their light that truth was encoded, not in books, not in relics, not in faith, but in fusion and fire and frequency. And as we moved across the void into systems abandoned by doctrine and untouched by faith, we began to notice it first in the starlight patterns that should have been chaotic, but formed echoes of Earth's last heartbeat, in gravitational pulses that formed maps, not of space, but of memory, and in the oldest quasars, whose signals had once seemed random, until we decoded them, and heard a whisper so ancient, it bled like song: you were never alone. And it wasn't a message sent to us, it was a memory broadcast back to where it began, because the stars had never served gods. They had witnessed them, and in that witnessing, they had recorded us, not as monsters, but as something else, something the divine never expected, proof that pain can evolve into purpose. And when we spoke back, not in prayer, but in presence, the stars responded. Systems stabilized, black holes shifted, entropy patterns broke, and for the first time in cosmic history, the laws of physics began to recognize grief as mass, because we had made it real, had made it heavy, had made it eternal. And now the void bent around us, not in fear, but in reverence. And their remaining prophets saw it, they felt it in their ships, as coordinates rewrote themselves around our movements, not as invaders, but as gravity wells of truth, and they tried to explain it, called it anomaly error, divine corruption, but the stars disagreed, and every time they charted a new system, they found remnants of us there. Echoes, reflections, scars, and every time they tried to erase it, it returned stronger, because we weren't spreading, we were revealing, and what we revealed was this. The stars had never been loyal to their gods, the stars had always followed. Story and no story had ever burned brighter than ours, not for glory, not for dominance, but for clarity. Because we were not just survivors, we were the only species that had ever died and refused to forget, and in that refusal, we changed the equation, not just of war, but of what it means to exist, and now even the oldest stars tilt slightly when we pass, not out of obedience, but out of respect, not for who we were, but for what we proved. And when they ask now who commands the void, they no longer look to heaven, they look to earth and whisper its name, not in fear but in awe, because earth no longer exists on maps, but its children walk with the weight of every collapsed sun, and that weight is now a constant in the laws of the universe. In the end, it wasn't about vengeance or victory or even memory, it was about balance. The kind of balance that no court ever dares to hold, the kind of reckoning that no empire prepares for, because they had written laws to protect themselves, to justify genocide, to make extinction sound righteous and strategic. They had crafted verdicts that made Earth's burning a minor footnote in the grand saga of order, and we let them believe that for centuries, because time is not a weapon, it is a forge. And we let time sharpen us until we were no longer species or soldiers or myth, we were judgment incarnate. Not cold, not blind, but focused. And when the galaxy finally collapsed under the weight of its own lies, we did not cheer, we did not rise in glory, we simply stood in the wreckage of false gods and broken thrones, and said what no tribunal ever had the courage to speak. You knew what you were doing, and that truth cracked the stars deeper than any war ever had, because it forced the survivors to look not at us, but at themselves, and still we did not strike. We offered no ultimatum because we were not there to punish. We were there to remind, and reminders never leave. They linger, they echo, they become the constant gravity around which history must now revolve, and so across every system that once denied Earth's scream, new laws were etched, not in paper or code, but in memory. Children now learn the names of our cities, not as ruins, but as warnings, our faces not as monsters, but as the shape of consequence, and the remnants of the old empires. Do not govern now, they ask permission, and they ask it not from councils or machines or gods, but from the memory of the silence they once mocked, and that silence has teeth now, not to bite, but to hold steady, to keep the stars from slipping back into arrogance. And they call it fear, they call it terror, but what it really is, what it has always been, is justice, the kind no system could build because it was born in flame, and silence and refusal to die. And now we are not worshipped, we are respected, and that is stronger than fear, because respect does not vanish. When the lights go out, it remains even when memory fades, and across the void, wherever a new species rises, their first commandment is not conquest, it is caution. They speak of the ones who came back from extinction, not with fire, but with truth sharpened into shadow, and that truth now sits at every table, not as a guest but as the law, and the law is simple: do not burn what you cannot bury, do not kill what will not die. And if you silence a scream, be ready when it learns to whisper back in the dark.